Good evening. If you've just joined me, this is Tonight Live on GB News, but let's get some breaking news. In the last half hour, ex-police officer Derek Chauvin has been sentenced to 22.5 years in prison over the death of George Floyd on the 25th of May last year. Chauvin was recorded kneeling on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes. His death sparked worldwide protests over police brutality and racial inequality. Now, let's take a look at the moment he was sentenced to 270 months or 22.5 years in prison.
Mr. Chauvin, as to count one, based on the verdict of the jury finding you guilty of unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony under Minnesota Statute 609.19 subdivision 2 paren 1, it is the judgment of the court that you now stand convicted of that offense. Pursuant to Minnesota Statute section 609.04, counts 2 and 3 will remain unadjudicated as they are lesser offenses of count 1. As sentenced for count 1, the court commits you to the custody of the Commissioner of Corrections for a period of 270 months. That's 270. That is a 10-year addition to the presumptive sentence of 150 months. This is based on your abuse of a position of trust and authority, and also the particular cruelty shown to George Floyd. You are granted credit for 199 days already served. Pay the mandatory surcharge of $78 to be paid from prison wages. You're prohibited from possessing firearms, ammunition, or explosives for the remainder of your life. Provide a DNA sample as required by law. Register as a predatory offender as required by law. And you will receive a copy of the order and also the attached memorandum explaining the court's analysis.
So joining me now is Leroy Logan, former superintendent in the Metropolitan Police and former chairman of the Black Police Association. Leroy, thank you for joining me this evening. I wanted to ask you, first of all, how has this sort of case affected policing in the UK?
Well, I think it's affected policing all over the world because whether you're a current officer or a retired officer, we have taken a similar oath to protect and serve, and to see how Derek Chauvin abused that oath and abused his authority and killed George Floyd in such a horrendous way, taking 9.5 minutes, has impacted officers around the world and wider communities, as we saw with the various protests and all sorts of outcries. And I would like to, give my respects to the Floyd family and the wider community in Minnesota for standing up for truth and justice has been seen to be done.
Well, I mean, after what happened with George Floyd, for you as a black officer, what was the impact to you personally? Obviously, you saw that. How did you feel after seeing such a thing, and how has it affected you personally?
Well, it brought a tear to my eye. I must admit, George Floyd could have been my brother, my cousin, whatever. And the fact that he died pleading for his life, pleading for his mother, it, for me, just beggars belief how someone could just sit by. And not only Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd, because remember, kneeling is a reverent action. He's showing reverence, and he was using a knee to literally suck the life out of George Floyd. But is the 3 other officers that at no stage tried to stop him or in any way pull him off or anything like that. And that's the issue for me is, you might say it's a bad apple in the barrel, but what's the good apples doing to prevent these sort of things? And I know those other officers are going to have their case heard at some stage in the near future. But for me, the police culture really needs to recognize that there is a real issue about officers speaking up against road cops. So the good apples have to speak up against the bad apples.
Do you think that the killing was actually something to do with race? Because as you mentioned, those officers, it does turn out that there were 4 officers there, of course, Derek Chauvin. The other officer was white. Then there was a black officer and a mixed race officer. Do you think that race played a part in this behaviour, or in your eyes, do you just think it's police brutality?
A lot of ways, I think there was a race factor, and definitely with Derek Chauvin, I think there was. You can't do that in such an inhumane way, and he was looking at George Floyd as an animal. So, and why would you do that? It was because of the colour of his skin, and he's never at any stage apologised. So that's the first thing, and I think there's a class thing as well. You know, he was just an insignificant person in his eyes, and he thought, well, he would suffer no consequences in taking his life in that way. And he just downplayed the whole thing, even when he reported the incident on the radio shortly after George Floyd is taken away by the paramedics. You know, this guy played up. I mean, it's terrible to hear him talk about it, that someone was visibly dead. And even the paramedics said he was dead at the scene. And he was just playing it. Oh, the man was just playing up. So for me, it's not just a race and a colour thing, but there's a class issue as well. And unfortunately, a power trip. Some officers don't know their boundaries. They're into control, power, and they think they can just be disproportionate and totally illegal in their actions. And unfortunately, we see cases like this over here in the UK. So it's not like we haven't had our own George Floyds and you know, the systemic failures that go with that. And of course, I would like to think senior leadership across the UK and the US will be looking at this and saying, we're going to make culture change. Otherwise, these things will happen again.
Well, it's interesting that you do mention culture, because it does seem to be a culture within the force, many forces. Because if you do, I mean, I've looked at the Minneapolis police, and the head of the Minneapolis police was actually a guy who was black and of mixed Latino, I think is of Asian origin. So he's certainly not white. And the force is very mixed. So it really is something that, as a culture, probably needs to really be looked at, and let's hope this will make some change. Do you think that there was the protests that occurred? Do you think that all these protests have made changes for people in this country, black people in particular?
Well, I think the whole Black Lives Movement sort of went right across the US and across the Atlantic to the UK and other parts of Europe and various parts of the world. So I think there's definitely created a commonality of people saying, well, listen, this is an example of how man can be so inhuman to another man. And we need to learn from that. And those people who are in positions of authority, police or otherwise, need to understand what they are called to do as public servants, especially here in the UK, and they have to know their boundaries. And I think the Black Lives Matter and other organizations are speaking up. So I think it's people power that will really hold authorities to account, because unfortunately we don't see the leadership in senior echelons of the police and politics. And even as recently as yesterday, the Daniel Atkinson case, where an officer tasered him for over 30 seconds when it should only be 5 seconds, and the fact that he was kicked him in his head and left a footprint or an outline of his boot laces on Mr. Atkinson's head. So these things are happening, and it has to be a wake-up call. And I think if there's any time to make changes, it's no time like the present, because we have seen so many things laid bare by Black Lives Matter, by the injustices in COVID and other terrible examples of institutional corruption, etc. So I would like to think it's a watershed moment, and senior officers in the police will step up and make the changes and hold those rogue cops to account. And those good apples need to challenge those bad apples and let them lead the organisation.
And what do you think, Leroy, are the challenges now for a lot of officers in the force? Because we are hearing of all sorts of different things that really aren't shedding the forces in favourable light. What do you think are the real challenges, and what do you think you can bring to it to try and change things?
Well, I think it is really important that regardless of where you are in the organisation, you need to understand that you're a public servant and you're there to serve the community, and understand that you can't do it alone. That's the thing. When you abuse your authority, you can't then go to the community and say, listen, we've got to work together and investigate that crime or make safer streets and whatever, because policing cannot be done on its own. Sir Robert Peel, when he actually brought in the Met Police in 1829, some of the things he spoke about, now called the Peelian Principles, one of the key elements was the police of the public and the public of the police. And that's been revised over the decades. And I would like to think that they really will focus on that police have to work with communities. Every time they abuse, whether it's stop and search or tasers or whatever it may be, that's eroding trust and confidence. And the cornerstone of policing is trust and confidence. So you need to be working with the community, because you can't stop and search you out of a problem. You can't arrest you out of a problem. You've got to work with communities and ensure that that relationship, that bridge building is sustained. So you've got to treat people with respect and dignity and don't abuse your authority. And be open and transparent, because if you get things wrong, don't try and hide. Don't try and close ranks. That's the name of my book, Closing Ranks at the Expense of Truth and Justice. You cannot allow it. So you've got to be open and transparent and acknowledge there's a problem and say we're going to deal with it, and make sure you're transparent in the way you do that.